In today's video, 3 people share their paranormal experiences. Whether a haunting lasts a lifetime, or it is just a one-time event, all it takes is one experience to make a person begin questioning what is truly out there. I'm curious to know, do you believe in ghosts? Drop a comment letting me know. I'd love to see some conversation about the topic. The writers of these stories can be found in the description. A huge thank you to them for allowing me to share their stories with all of you. If you have a creepy ghost story of your own, or any story that you feel is worth sharing, be sure to send it to rylhstories@gmail.com. Your story may be featured in a future video. Be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed tonight's lineup. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. I have kept these stories to myself for a long time, and really just want to recount a couple of the thoughts and experiences I had from my year living in a house I wholeheartedly believe was haunted. Some background. I grew up in a small town in Texas, and lived in the same house for the first 11 years of my life. It was a decently friendly neighborhood. We would throw block parties and all the neighbors were friendly and would hang out. Except for the family in the house directly across the street from mine. They very much kept to themselves. Despite having 2 kids of similar age to me, and my friends on the block, the neighbors' kids would never come out to play or join in the block parties. This, of course, was not an issue, as while they did not socialize with us, we saw the kids frequently, and they seemed happy and in good health, and both of the adults seemed normal and nice. Just not at all talkative. Several times we would invite the boys to shoot hoops with us or toss the football, when we would see them playing by themselves in their yard, but they would give a curt "no thanks," and shake their head no. They were homeschooled, so we didn't have the chance to hang out with them at school. One day, without even so much as a for sale sign ever being in the yard, a giant moving truck was rapidly loading up the entire contents of the house across the street. My dad went across the street and asked if the movers knew anything about why our neighbors were moving, and the movers revealed the family had actually already up and left to India 2 days earlier, leaving most of their belongings. The movers were being paid to move all the furniture out and take it to be shipped, as the family was not returning. Within the day, the moving van was gone, and it wasn't for another 2 days that a for sale sign went up. Very rare for our neighborhood given the high demand for housing, due to the local schools. Houses on and around our streets were selling in 3 weeks. It was as if they had just went up and left one night suddenly, without plan or care for their worldly possessions. My friends and I would all get creepy vibes from the house, and for a long time it wouldn't sell. After about 6 months, the for sale sign disappeared, and the house sat vacant for another 2 years. Finally, the house was leased to a nice couple with children from another town over. That would be the same year my parents moved us to a different house in the same town. A couple years later, my parents would divorce the summer of 7th grade, but wanting to keep things civil and easy for me and my siblings, my mom began looking for houses around our town. As luck would have it, there was a house up for lease in a very familiar location. The house across the street from my childhood home. I'll begin with the first and most extensive oddity I ever noticed, and now only in retrospect do I realize how truly disturbing it was. The house was 2 stories, with 3 bedrooms upstairs and 1 bedroom downstairs. Being the oldest sibling of 3, I took the downstairs bedroom so that my siblings could have the 2 bedrooms sharing a floor with my mom's master bedroom. The media room was directly next to my room. It was big and meant to be a home theater space, but we did not have home theater equipment, so it became the office/gaming room in the house. The media room was directly beneath my mom's bedroom, and extended halfway under her bathroom, and my room was directly beneath the back of her bathroom and an attic space. Not too long after moving in, I began to notice the sound of footsteps I would hear while home alone. I had a tendency to play hooky from school. My siblings were both involved in after-school programs, and my mom worked full-time, so I often found myself home alone. Quite often I would hear the sounds of footsteps from the room above me, Initially, I dismissed them as the house settling, the AC kicking on, or perhaps a sibling I hadn't realized was home. The footsteps were not loud enough as to immediately give themselves away as such. They would also move in a specific repeated pattern. I never counted the steps exactly, but it would take 8 to 10 steps in the same path every time. It would come from my mom's bathroom above, curve slowly to the right in a U shape towards the door, and finally stop where the doorway was for my mom's room. Due to the unnatural, repetitive nature of the footsteps, it was easy to dismiss as something explainable. After getting settled in the house, however, I began to actually learn what the sound of the AC clicking on was, and it did not sound at all similar to the noises I had been hearing above my head. After realizing that, I purposely set the AC to kick on in the media room. While I listened very closely in the area, I had been hearing the footsteps. When the AC kicked on, I was able to confirm that indeed, it was nowhere close to the sounds I had been hearing. I also knew for a fact at that point that I indeed had been completely home alone, on almost every occasion where I had heard the footsteps, ruling out, for the most part, that it had been a person actually walking. I began to really take notice of the footsteps at this point, still not out of fear for something paranormal, but rather just for curiosity of the house. At this point, I had pipe noises pegged as the culprit. Again, however, this did not hold up to scrutiny, as the closest shower and bath were in the back of my mom's bathroom, an inefficiently long way from where I was hearing the sounds. The footsteps would also curve through the room in a U towards the door, which seems unusual for plumbing. The sound would also stop in a very specific spot, right where my mom's door was, which makes no sense for plumbing within the floor plan of the house. At this point, I had exhausted all my rational explanations, and began to fear something weird was going on. The next couple times I heard it, I was afraid, and just kind of froze up for a bit, and listened intensely, but never once heard a sound after the final methodic footstep. I would specifically listen to how it sounded when my mom would actually walk upstairs above me, and comparing it to the sounds I had been hearing, I came to the conclusion that it was the same sound. Only my mom's footsteps were heavier than the footsteps I had been hearing. I also observed it would take my mom several more steps to cover the same area as the sounds I'd been hearing. I soon began to get bold upon hearing the footsteps, and would try to rush out to greet whatever the noise was at my mom's door. You can see her door very clearly from the living room on the first floor, but no matter how quickly I got there after hearing the last step, there was never anything there. Once or twice I rushed up the stairs and rushed into her room with a weapon, and upon a quick search, never found a thing out of place. Not being able to find any explanation or even a single clue, I began to just give up, and would ignore the sound to the point that by the time we moved, I had all but zoned it out completely. After moving out, I asked my younger brother if he had ever heard the footsteps. He said only sometimes, when he was homesick from school while he was playing games. He said it would always terrify him, and he would freeze and pray until his fear passed. I had never brought it up to my mom, but he had, and Mom had told him it was just his imagination, or the house settling, and that he really needn't worry about it. However, we can both agree that we never once heard them when anybody else was in the house, and that they were distinctly the sound of footsteps. Opened from the inside. When I was a child, I would have reoccurring nightmares of wolves running through my bedroom door and attacking me as I hid under the blankets. Due to this fear, as long as I can remember, I've only been completely comfortable sleeping in a room with a closed and locked door. It is and was such a routine in my life that I could not sleep if my door wasn't shut and locked. The locks on the door of the house were cheap doorknob locks, and did not have a safety on the other side of the knob to be able to unlock the door with a key or a pin. Once it was locked from the inside, it could only be unlocked from the inside. My mom had a Yorkie named Gizmo, and for some reason, despite having slept in Mom's bed his whole life, Gizmo would absolutely refuse to sleep in her bedroom at that house, and would whine until he was let out of the room. Since he had to be let out early in the morning, and I had football practice in the morning, he would sleep with me on my bed. One night I remember waking up with a terribly uneasy feeling. I was wide awake suddenly from a dreamless deep sleep, and I sat straight up and immediately checked the door. Even in the pitch dark, I could sense it was wide open. Knowing I had locked it before I had gone to bed, I immediately froze and began listening. What I heard next scared me so bad. I'm sure it changed the rhythm of my heartbeat, as Gizmo began a low, mean growl. At this point, my eyes were beginning to adjust, and indeed my worst fear was confirmed. The door was wide open. Gizmo was pointed in the direction of the door, continuing to growl. Gizmo was not the type to growl. He was a yipper every time he saw a dog on a walk or the doorbell rang. Really, the only time he ever growled other than that was over other dogs trying to steal his food. It was incredibly rare to hear him do that, and as far as I could see, he was growling at a fixed point near the door, but there was nothing. After a moment of this, I was going mad just laying there, so I called out hello. Who's there? No response, or any sound at all. The dog had stopped growling, but was still fixed on a spot near the door. Using the element of surprise, I sprung out of bed suddenly, slammed the door shut, and flipped on the lights. I went to relock it, but saw the lock was already in the engaged position. Another wave of panic washed over me, as I realized the door could have only been opened from inside my room. I immediately checked my window. It was securely locked and the screen was undisturbed. My closet was too small for anyone to have hidden in it, and I had been in there immediately prior to going to bed. I have never sleptwalked in my life, and even if I had been sleepwalking that night, I find it unlikely I would have had the dexterity to disengage the lock, open the door, and then re-engage the lock. While I regret this decision in reflection, as it could have been a home invader, I was simply too scared to explore the pitch-dark house, and it was far too late to contact any adults besides the police. But I did not feel confident calling the cops out to investigate what I believed to be an unexplainable occurrence. To this day, I have no explanation for how that door opened. I was not the only one to experience strange occurrences in the house, and I find my family stories to be the most compelling of the lot. While I do not have the intimate details, I will repeat the stories exactly as they were told to me. As mentioned in the previous story, sleepwalking was not a trait of my family, and I cannot recall a time I had ever caught my mom or either of my siblings sleepwalking. My mom is a very conservative East Texas woman, and does not drink so much as a glass of wine. She truly detests alcohol, and the way it makes her feel, so she would not have been wandering the house drunk at nights without remembering. My sister at breakfast one morning asked my mom why she had come to spend the night with her in the middle of the night. Looking slightly puzzled, my mom asked my sister what she meant. My sister then described that she had been awoken last night to my mom gently shaking her shoulder from behind and whispering her name. My sister, without rolling over to face her, asked her what she wanted. She said my mom then asked, "May I sleep here next to you?" in a flat tone of voice. My sister said yes, and felt mom climb into the bed next to her, and under the covers, and my sister promptly fell back asleep. My sister said she woke up only a couple hours later to get a glass of water. Mom was already gone from her bed and back to her room. My mom laughed it off, exclaiming she must have sleepwalked. After talking to my mom about my experiences years later, however, she brought up the story my sister told as the most bone-chilling of all to her, as she claimed she had been in her room tossing and turning that whole night, wide awake, and had not been to visit my sister at any point in the night. My mom had the most direct experience of us all, having been living in the room where the activity seemed to be focused. She described waking up several nights while living there, to her bathroom light being on when she knew she had turned it off before bed. She said whenever this would happen, she would feel an intense feeling of being watched, as well as an incredible sense of dread. Several times she recalled she would get up and turn off the lights, only to have it turn back on by itself in the couple moments when she would turn around to walk back to her bed. On nights like where the lights would turn back on before her eyes, she said she refused to get back up to turn the light off, sensing that it would be a very bad idea to venture back in. She felt as if it was a lure for something horrifying. The most shocking story, and the one that changed my entire perception of the paranormal, was one she made me promise not to tell my siblings until they were older. One night we were staying with our dad, My mom invited her boyfriend of the time to come over and watch a movie in the living room. They had dimmed the lights and were watching a movie in semi-darkness. It is important to recall that you can see the door to my mom's room from the living room. At some point, my mom had fallen asleep next to him on the couch. He had stayed up to finish whatever movie they were watching. My mom says he shook her awake suddenly and whispered to her, "I thought your kids were with their dad for the night." My mom, only half awake, replied, "They are. Why?" She said she felt her boyfriend stiffen up immediately at her response, and he suddenly sounded nervous as he replied, "I felt like someone was watching me. So I looked up towards your room and saw a young girl standing in your doorway, looking over the banister at me. As soon as I looked over, she retreated back to your room." My mom snapped awake, and terrified together, they decided to go spend the night back at his house without much hesitation. My mom said that it was only her third or fourth date with the guy, and she'd had made no mention on previous dates of any of the spooky experiences at the house for fear of making him think she was strange. I know for a fact my mom would never had agreed to spend the night at such a new boyfriend's house so quickly, so she must have been truly scared to even consider that as an option. He saw something, he swore by it, and my mom surely believed him. For those of you who are gonna say he was just banging my mom, there is absolutely no reason they wouldn't have been able to at her house, and there is no reason why she would even have to tell that story as an alibi, because I never would have known anyway. Her reasons for not spending the night at a new boyfriend's house is born of safety necessity, not from bendable convictions. I know my mom, and she does not lie or exaggerate stories, especially about spiritual things. We managed to make it through an entire year's lease, but renewing our lease was off the table for my mom. No actual harm ever befell us, and the only one to have seen anything with their eyes was my mom's ex-boyfriend. I have reflected on this a lot over the years, and every time I revisit the memories, I become more disturbed than the last time I thought about it. While living there and for years after, it was incredibly easy to just pretend what I experienced was not a big deal, and was better left ignored, as not to needlessly frighten my siblings for my God-fearing mother. For one, I have never experienced random feelings of being watched, or anxiety to the extent that I did in that house, and as frequently. I believe that to be the sixth sense kicking in due to whatever energy was in that house. If the boyfriend can be believed, and if my mom can believe him, then I can. The theory of a little girl haunting my mom's room makes perfect sense. The light footsteps, the light game with my mom, being small enough to share a bed with my sister without disturbing her to the point where she would wake up and roll over. My sister is the only one to have experienced an event while other family was in the house. Every time my mom, my brother, or I had an experience, it was when we were home alone. My mom revealed to me that within weeks after she had moved in, and after the occurrences had started, she felt anxious that someone might have been living secretly in the attic space, and had balanced a bobby pin in such a way that it would have to fall over to the floor if the door was open from either side. It was also set up so that it would be impossible to replicate while also shutting the door behind you, on your way back into the attic. She said that bobby pin never once moved on its own, eliminating the possibility someone was secretly living in the house. This information is incredibly relieving to me, and at the same time, also terrifying. I am 100% convinced I did not open my door that night, and I never heard that dog growl at anything or anyone like he did that night, before or since. I've heard people suggest a CO2 leak, but it seems impossible to me that could be the case, given the specific circumstances of the occurrences. Only hearing things when we were home alone, mom's lights flickering only in the deep middle of the night. I used to be a skeptic. Even after experiencing this, for years I remained a skeptic. But at this point in my life, with the evidence I have been presented, I truly have no earthly explanation for what me and my family experienced in our time there. I believe I took part in a paranormal haunting of a residence. None of us had ever had a ghost story before living in that house, and have not had any ghost experiences since moving. Despite the horrors on the home front, it was an exceedingly good year for just about everyone in the family, which makes me deny a possible curse on our family. I know I lived in a haunted house, and I have experienced things that I will never be able to explain, and I finally have found the courage to share my experience with the broader public. For starters, back when I lived in Alberta for the first 11 years of my life, I lived in the same house for all of that time. I was even born in it, actually. We were renting the rectory, which was directly beside my church, since my parents worked there. These events took place from when I was around 3 years old, as far back as my memory goes, to when I was 11, when my family and I moved out of that house. I am now 17. Starting at 3 years old, I started having very surreal dreams and hallucinations. My parents did not take me to church at that age yet. My brother would stay home and watch me, so I had no idea of what any religious symbols were at that time. But I started dreaming about angels. The most memorable one I had was when I dreamt of an angel carrying me to the bathroom for some reason. She then showed me a book which had a bunch of names written in it, and she pointed to mine. I woke up after that, and later that day, I decided to tell my mom about that dream. She thought it was extremely interesting, because I later found out years after that she bought the book I was describing that was in my dream. The book in my dream was the Book of Life. Here is the copy and pasted definition. In Christianity and Judaism, the Book of Life is the book in which God records the names of every person who is destined for heaven or the world to come. I would also hallucinate angels, mostly when I looked out of doorways. They were very incomplete apparitions, but I could still see them clearly. However, it was not all godly and heavenly things I hallucinated. This is where the more scary stuff begins happening. Most of my hallucinations up until then did not scare me at all. In fact, they were very comforting mostly. Starting at around 5, I started to have horrific nightmares. Hellish, demonic, everything of the sort. Nothing a 5-year-old should be dreaming about. I would see demons crawl around my house as I walked through my house terrified, with blood staining and streaking the walls, my stairs, furniture, everything. There was also an ominous red-colored light that went all throughout the house. When I thought back on that dream later, it was like I was envisioning hell inside of my house. At this time, I also started hallucinating. Instead of angels, black shadows walking through my house, standing in corners as I slept. I would also scream for my mom and dad to run because they sometimes looked like they were trying to hurt my parents in some way, putting their hands over their throats, etc. Of course, they didn't feel anything and were 100% safe. Once I learned that these things couldn't hurt anyone in any way, I started to calm down when I saw them around. Those hallucinations also stopped after a while, and I moved on to seeing other things instead. I would still have nightmares quite often, and one night when I had one, I woke up. I don't know what time it was, but it was still dark out. I sat up in bed and I saw an apparition of a very young boy, maybe around 5 years old max, same age as me at the time, standing in the middle of my room. The boy was wearing overalls and nothing else, and he had extremely pale skin. That vision went away after about 10 seconds of me staring at it. This boy didn't make me scared though. I just stared at him and he looked at me like he understood me or something. I can't really explain it. This was interesting as well because my dad told us a story that when we were living in that same house, he woke up early morning on a weekend around 6 a.m. He went downstairs and he saw that our back door was for some reason open. My dad was always paranoid about locking and closing the doors, so we have no idea how that happened. He heard a child's laughter coming from beside our church. This would be nothing unusual, as my church also served as a school which I went to. However, this was 6 a.m. on a weekend. No child should have been around at that time. Knowing this, my dad went to see what was going on, and he found nothing. No cars, no children, absolutely nothing. No evidence anyone had been there that morning either. I moved into my second bedroom when I was around 7 years old. An important thing to note here is that the rectory I lived in was massive. I'm talking big. and my parents moved me and my brother into a huge bedroom. My bed was facing the huge closet, which covered I'd say 1/3 of the wall. I'm guessing the closet was around 6 to 8 feet wide. This closet had double doors, which you had to slide onto each other to close it. One night it was left a little bit open, so in the middle of the night there was a small crack in the door. When I was trying to sleep, I made the mistake of opening my eyes and I saw a churned hand coming from around that crack in the closet. Its fingers looked like burnt hot dogs. You know how that look is. This hallucination made me feel like I was actually in danger, and I screamed bloody murder and my parents came running in. I cried for a good 10 minutes after that, and my parents moved my bed away from the closet the next night. Some more odd things that I used to hallucinate were bats exploding from one of my walls. They would constantly come out of the wall and fly out of the door. When I looked away from that wall, however, I didn't see any more bats flying from any other walls. It was just that one particular wall where I saw these bats, just constantly pouring out of my wall. So I just looked away and everything was fine. My most memorable experience I've ever had, though, was when I was around 10 years old. At this point, most of my hallucinations were calming down, though I still had them, and I still had very odd feelings in that house. I was having another very surreal dream, and when I woke up from it, I swear to God it felt like I was levitating 3 feet in the air for a split second when I woke up, before I felt myself slamming onto my bed. It shook and everything. Up to this day, I still have no idea whether that was my imagination. That is everything I remember from my childhood. Like I said, I am now 17 years old, living in Ontario, Canada, and I have not hallucinated since I left that rectory back in 2013. If anyone has any questions about these experiences, or could possibly have any reason to why I had them, I'd be happy to talk with you. This story is going to be a bit all over the place, but I'll try to explain everything as simply as I can. This particular incident takes place when I was about 11 years old. I lived in a house that was built in the early 1900s, so needless to say, it definitely had its fair share of creepy vibes. Most of the main floor had been refurnished, along with the whole entire upstairs. My dad was slowly making his way towards the basement, repairing and rebuilding different parts of the house as he went. There were about 3 rooms in the basement. However, there was one room that no one had ever been in. It didn't have a door, and looking into it from the hallway was enough to creep you out. It had walls of concrete and was literally a giant cobweb. The only thing that sat in the maybe 10 by 12 room was a metal pole that rested against the wall. I always did my best to not look into the room because, as I said, it gave me some serious chills. One night I was sleeping in my room, as usual, when I had a terrifying nightmare. I dreamt I was in the basement by myself and felt drawn towards the ever so haunted room. No matter how much I tried to get away from it, I was only drawn in more. When I got to it, there was a female in maybe her early 40s crying in the corner. She was pale and covered in cut marks that appeared to be from a knife. I began trying to turn towards the steps with everything I had, when all of this sudden she turns to face me. Her face was covered in blood, and she had an impossibly wide grin. Before I could begin totally freaking out, I woke up, sweat pouring down my face. I was completely put off from going into the basement for any reason after that, until one day, about 2 days later, when my mom asked me to go downstairs to get some steaks out of the freezer. I argued that I really didn't want to, but she wouldn't budge. So I begrudgingly walked down the stairs, trying to man up about the nightmare I had. I walked to the other side of the basement with no problem. But as I was grabbing the steaks, I had an overwhelming feeling something was watching me. Trying to calm down, I kept a normal pace going back to the steps. While walking past the room, I felt a chill go up my spine, causing me to freeze in place. I'm not sure why I did, but I glanced over and what happened next is one of the freakiest things I've ever seen. The pole, the one that had been in there for years, covered in webs, popped off the ground by about 2 feet and came crashing down on the floor, causing a loud metallic sound to ring through the basement. I wasted no time. I dropped everything in my hands and ran up the stairs crying my eyes out. My mom came running to me trying to figure out what was wrong. I tried my best to explain everything, minus the nightmare, but it probably came out as gibberish. She told me to calm down and that she would go grab what she needed. I am 18 now, and still living in the same house. Nothing odd has happened since, and we never did get around to fixing up the basement. I believe at this point my dad never will. He says it's a lost cause due to the layout and the limitations on what we could even use it for. Even though this story may seem very minor when written out, I can't even begin to explain how I felt in that moment. There is no way that pole, which had been there for who knows how many years, suddenly popped up like that for no reason. There is more to this world, and it terrifies me.